Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Tanya Ash. I'm a Director of Programs and Member Engagement here at World Trade Center Denver. This webinar is part of our Tariff Navigation series delivered in partnership with the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. And also, this one specifically is with Colorado Lawyer Committee through the state's Economic Resilience Technical Assistance Program. The goal of this series is to give you practical strategies around sourcing, classification, compliance, so you can better plan and respond. We already had 6 of these webinars, so if you have missed any of them, please go on our YouTube channel to review. But we've heard such a great positive feedback from all of you from our community that we decided to continue, and we scheduled 3 more webinars. So if you haven't registered for the future ones, we have next one coming up next Friday. For nearly 40 years, World Trade Center Denver has supported companies navigating imports, exports, and global operations. And over the past year, we worked closely with hundreds of businesses specifically on tariff-related solutions. In addition to this webinar, we're also offering a direct support. Through OEDIT, qualifying companies can access up to $1,000 matching reimbursement grant to help offset consulting cost. So if you're interested, please fill out the request form in the chat and schedule initial discovery call. Or if you just have any questions, feel free to reach out and just talk about that. With that, we have a very interesting topic today, which is recovering hidden tariff costs through the supply chain. And we have 2 phenomenal speakers, Ryan Burns and Russell Manhart. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. So as Tanya said, I'm Ryan Burns. I'm with Simprax, and we are a consultancy that helps manufacturers reduce the cost, risk, and environmental impact of their supply chains. And excited to be here today and talking about some of the portions of tariffs that haven't gotten as much, I would say, press is that there's so many that people did not pay directly as importers of record, yet were passed along to them. So we're going to talk about different strategies and how to figure out what those are and how to recover those. Russell?
Thanks, Ryan. My name is Russell Menhart. I'm an international trade lawyer at a law firm called Taft, Stettinius and Hollister, and so spend my days helping importers and downstream companies that have been impacted by tariffs to deal with them. And I'm going to jump in here after I let Ryan lead off with some legal observations, and then we'll sort of hopefully leave enough time for some questions and answers at the end.
All right. Thank you very much. So I think the biggest question is, what we'll cover today. Like I said, why you're here, even if you've never imported anything directly yourself, right? We'll be talking about how you can address the embedded tariffs that you might have paid or been charged by your supply base. We'll talk about just the current landscape and the current refund landscape. Russell's going to help with that. Sizing the cost that you might have absorbed through supplier pricing to better understand what you might be able to recover or what you might have coming back to you potentially. How to prioritize that and run the recovery conversation and start those negotiations with your supply base. And then, as Russell said, we're going to try and leave a lot of time for questions and talk through next steps to we can address anything that you would like to. Feel free to put that in the chat. So the first thing, I like to point out is that if you're not the importer of record, you don't have the ability to go in and file a refund on your own, but the money does exist. It's just not in your account. It is in your supplier's account, right? So you likely paid tariffs too, whether you were directly told that or not. So you didn't import yourself, or there's some items that you didn't import yourself, right? So you're not going to get the refund, goes to who imported it, and that's typically either your supplier or perhaps it's even their supplier, right? Maybe you're dealing with someone who's a distributor of goods that they paid it and passed it on to you. So what we need to remember here is that when I'm talking about that portion with your supply base, this isn't a customs filing question. it's really a commercial one, right? How much did I absorb as their customer? And then how much can I potentially get back? With that in mind, too, it's not only real, but it can be bigger than you think, right? So the New York Fed said about 75% of businesses hit with tariff-driven cost pass that, at least some of it through to their customers, right? I believe that many of them, especially after the first few months, started passing a lot of it onto their customers. And I think the amount that they passed was typically how much the market would bear in whatever they were selling, right? And depending on how they were compared to their competition who might have not been hit by tariffs, et cetera. So it's not just manufacturing, right? That's kind of where my purview is most of the time. But this is also distributors, retailers, whether it's contractors, food and beverage, even medical and dental practices, anybody who purchased goods that were physical, that were imported, likely were impacted by this in some way. And so, really here, the asymmetry is your opportunity, right? Because refunds are flowing upstream, right? But the prices are always sticky on the way down. I think that's one thing that we hear a lot, especially now with gas prices, is a perfect example of things that it's really easy to raise the price, and yet they seem to come down very, very slowly. So the rough scale here, right, is if you spent more than $1 million in goods that had meaningful pass-through tariff exposure, that could mean up to a six-figure embedded cost for yourself, right? And it's going to vary wildly depending on the type of suppliers, the type of goods that you have. So this is all going to be very general in that respect. So you need to think about how it translates to you. But if you have a decent amount of spend that was in fact affected by a price increase, there's likely opportunity. Russell, do you want to take us through some of the types of tariffs?
Yes, thanks a lot, Ryan. And so I want to jump in here and talk a little bit of just a reminder primer on the legal landscape of tariffs. Obviously, we are talking today only about refunds of IEEPA tariffs. That was the major legal case that existed. But the reason I wanted to start by highlighting the sheer number of tariffs that exist, and most of which are new in the last 12 to 18 months, is for two reasons. One is to highlight that it's very complicated to sort of reverse engineer what tariffs your suppliers may have paid and what is eligible for refunds, and then also to sort of look forward looking and suggest that there may be repeated iterations of this refund process. So just to run through the many flavors of tariffs out there, there are base tariffs that have always been paid. Those are global and range from 0 to 12% on goods. There have been China-specific Section 301 tariffs that were in place since 2018 on many goods coming out of China. IEEPA tariffs is the focus of this conversation, and those were implemented in February 2025. But since February 2025, there have also been additional rounds of Section 232 special tariffs put on certain goods, most importantly, steel, aluminum, copper, and auto parts. We've since had additional Section 232 investigations of lumber and pharmaceuticals and other. Then we had a 5-month period of temporary tariffs called 122. And starting July 24th, we have something called forced labor tariffs. And now we're facing two additional tariffs, one called manufacturing overcapacity, Section 301 tariffs, and then a new untested version of the Trade Act called Section 338, which was just proposed to go in place on Canadian goods in about 2 weeks from now. Can you go to the next slide, Ryan? Now I've highlighted many of these. I really could also add the Section 301 manufacturing capacity and Section 338 tariffs. What I've highlighted are all the tariffs that are subject to litigation. So the IEEPA tariffs are the only one that reached a end game where the Supreme Court of the United States in February 2026, in the case that made all the headline news, was actually determined to be illegal. And the administration was told you cannot impose those IEEPA tariffs. And then when it was sent down to a lower court, the lower court said, and that order, that Supreme Court order, means you have to refund all of the IEEPA tariffs you collected since February 2025. That's the main process we're talking about. But I just want to start by highlighting there's active litigation right now over Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, over Section 122 tariffs that many importers and you have been paying, the downstream users, and then Section 301 forced labor just were introduced 2 weeks ago, but are already subject to their own litigation. I fully expect litigation on the next round of Section 301 tariffs and the Section 338 tariffs. My point is, it's very important that we understand as downstream customers that this refund process may we may see future iterations of it now that it's in place for other tariffs that the courts order customs to refund. So it behooves us to think hard about the terms and conditions we have with our suppliers who are charging us tariff surcharges. Go ahead, Ryan. So, and again, just for a little bit of legal background, I think it's important that even though this audience today, you probably are mostly not direct importers of record yourself, it's important to understand what importers are going through. So in February 2026, Supreme Court, as I said, announced that the IEEPA tariffs were illegal. And initially, the government suggested they were going to challenge that and try to find ways. I think they suggested they could drag this out in the courts for years. But they actually pivoted very quickly and cooperated. And CPB, to its credit, Customs and Border Protection, the agency in charge of collecting tariffs, has been incredibly cooperative. Once the Court of International Trade, which is a lower federal court, ordered them to refund tariffs, they've been very cooperative with creating a very efficient, admirably efficient system of refunding these tariffs. It's called CAPE, the Consolidated Administration and Processing of Entry System. And it launched on April 20th, so 2 months after the Supreme Court decision. That is extremely fast in government terms when you think about them having to build an entire new software system to accept applications for and then refund tariffs. There is currently no end date or closing date on which importers can submit a request for refunds. So, you may have suppliers telling you they have not been able to get their refunds yet for a variety of reasons. That's an excuse we're hearing sometimes. Some of those reasons are legitimate, others are shakier. But, for now, an importer can still go and seek their entries, their refunds. As Ryan mentioned, only the importer of record can apply for a refund. There is a single entity, legal entity listed on every Customs Form 7501. That's an official form that is submitted to Customs with every shipment that comes into the US that identifies the legally responsible party. And that is the only party that can apply for refunds. They can either submit it themselves through a CPB system, a software system called ACE, or a customs broker that handled that actual shipment can also file for refunds. But no third party has any way to intervene. This was done for practical administrative reasons by CAPE. But once an importer actually submits an application, it's very simple. They provide the numbers of all the entries that have been impacted by IEEPA tariffs. And then the ACE system has a highly automated process for checking and validating the entries. Can you go to the next slide, Ryan? CPB then estimated that refunds would be issued 60 to 90 days after submission, and it actually has been happening faster than that for many of our importer clients. We've had a fair number of clients already get back 100% of their IEEPA tariffs. As I said, though, if you are hearing from your suppliers that they have not received refunds yet, there are a variety of legitimate reasons for that. One is that certain complicated types of imports, including very old entries from like early 2025 that are past a certain time frame of being final, have been paused, and those still are not eligible for refunds. There's a complicated court order-based system that's going to go into effect, we think, in early September for that chunk of imports. And that has been, for our importer clients, I'd say on average 10 to 20% of their refunds are still pending that. It's called phase 3. Some importers use a special custom system called reconciliation, which means they were not able to apply for any refunds until late June. But the vast majority of importers have been able to apply, and over 250,000 CAPE applications have been submitted to Customs. According to the CPB's latest reports, they have to do regular updates to the Court of International Trade. And their latest update just earlier this week actually said that an estimated $100 billion had already been processed and certified and transferred to Treasury. That does not mean that money has already made it to importers for a variety of reasons. First, the government is holding back any funds that might be owed to the government for other reasons. Second, some very large brokers, including FedEx, have actually unilaterally applied for the refunds without even informing their customers in many cases. and they have gotten most of their money back, but they have not yet passed it on to their customers. So it's sort of a contentious issue right now with FedEx, where they are working on their own sort of downstream refund process. So I'm just trying to give all of you a sense of sort of how complicated this refund process is. Yes, the money is flowing, but there are also reasons why many importers have not yet received their share of the refunds. Go ahead, Ryan. I'll pivot now into leading back into some of Ryan's comments, just to say that, from our perspective, representing both importers and downstream companies that have been impacted by tariffs, these refunds are, especially the downstream, are going to be very complex. The amount you may have paid a supplier for pass-through tariffs, even if it's a clear line item tariff surcharge, could represent many, many things, depending on your industry. For example, as going back to the first slide I showed, a lot of goods coming into the United States and materials coming into the United States have been impacted by Section 232 tariffs, some new anti-dumping tariffs, the other kind of Section 301 tariffs. So all of those are not yet subject to refunds and maybe never will be. So you may be seeing tariff-related price increases that are not within the refund category. Yes, there's $100 billion in refunds eligible, but there are still large swaths of goods that have been subject to tariffs that are still in place and will remain in place. Second, we've seen a lot of confusion about the fact that sometimes the IEEPA refunds were actually a cap inclusive of base tariffs. So, for example, if you bought some machinery from an Italian manufacturer and they shipped you $1 million in products, and then they had a tariff surcharge applied to it, you may look at the tariff rate, which for the EU was 15% for most of last year, and say, well, I should be owed back $150,000 because they got that refund back. However, the 15% tariff actually was inclusive of something called the base tariff rate, a standard tariff rate on goods that depends on the class of goods you imported. So if the base tariff rate was 6.7%, the importer is only going to be getting 8.3% back from customs. So they may actually be having to figure out for themselves what percent of the tariff paid actually is being refunded. Finally, I mentioned already that CPB is also holding back some of the refunds for other fees. So the bottom line for me is that, without importer cooperation or a very detailed understanding of the customs treatment of goods that were brought into the US on your behalf, for example, knowing your harmonized tariff schedule code, knowing the valuation process, it's very, very hard to reverse engineer and calculate exactly what you should be owed. Turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Russell. So you can't recover what you can't see, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about and try to walk you through one very basic example of how you can kind of think about how you might determine how much you think you could be owed. And, Russell kind of alluded to this. These are very complex, right? Once you get outside of the direct refunds that someone who is the importer is owed, right? I like to say there's a lot of art and some science in it too, right? But let's talk about some of the things that you can do to gather the data to understand what the scope of your opportunity might be. So the first is to map your spend. So that's by your supplier, by category. Think about where the price increases would have come from, right? If that's a category that's heavily influenced by a commodity like metals, there may be multiple things that are driving that, not just tariffs, right? When did you see the increases, right? Think about the dates that tariffs were levied, right? Does it make sense that you saw price increases at that time? And then by how much, right? How much did they increase your pricing? And how much does that make sense with the normal inflation rates that you would have expected, or the normal commodity increases that you might have seen over that time? Then overlay that timeline, right? Compare that price increase timing against when IEEPA tariffs took effect. This is the one that I'm focused on here, right? Because these are the ones that have been refunded or are able to be refunded right now due to the court decision. So those are the ones that we really need to focus on. The other tariffs that they paid, they are still paying them, right? Let's talk about, can you confirm origin and product type? to understand if you really know your supplier well, this could be an easy exercise. For many, many suppliers, I think you're going to find that you don't necessarily know them that well. You know that you might know where they are doing their final assembly of the goods that you buy, but you may not know where all the inputs are coming from, right? So thinking about if you can try to understand of what I'm purchasing from this supplier or from my group of suppliers, what would actually have sat under a tariff, right? What rate would I have expected it to be specifically on the IEPA based on what I know about their products and their supply chain? And then,
Right. Sorry,
yes,
can I jump in there?
of course.
I think it's a great point, and the more you can dig in into and understand the underlying key factors that go into calculating tariffs, the HTS classification I mentioned, the country of origin, and the valuation, it arms you to go have these difficult conversations you may have to have with your suppliers. I mean, I think of an example. We were advising a company that makes pharmaceutical goods, and they were buying compounds, ingredients from a third party importer. Um, and when we started talking about refunds, downstream refunds, we actually went in and analyzed the components they were buying from the supplier and realized that most of them had been exempt from IEEPA tariffs all along, but they had seen price increases. And that armed them to go into a much different sort of conversation with their supplier to push them and understand, what is exactly going on here. And I think they ultimately tried to negotiate additional transparency going forward, right? So that they don't have these questions about what is actually underlying price increases.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great one too. I think, I'll kind of mention it later. Anytime that you're trying to build this type of should cost view for a supplier that you don't have that price transparency with, and I would say that it is pretty rare, especially for small to mid-sized businesses, to get full open book pricing from their supply base. So most people don't have that type of knowledge until they start doing the research, right, or asking the right questions. So, the last part here was talking about let's build a should cost view, right? So if this tariff had never existed, right, or if it didn't exist at that time, what should this good have cost, right? And as you do those calculations, that becomes what I call the recovery pools, right? So that is what is potentially owed back to you by your supplier. So we'll walk through an example that I made up, and I think here too is once again, I'm trying to keep the math a little bit simple. I'm trying to keep this example pretty simple, right? There's a lot more complexity that goes into this. But one thing I want to remind people too is as we're doing all these calculations, a lot of people, it's going to be very, very different for each supplier. We know that a lot of them ate some of the tariffs at the beginning, right? And some of them probably continued to do that because the market required it, right? Maybe they had other competitors that were not using imported goods or had an opportunity to not have to raise their price and they had a max that they could take it to. The other thing is that remember, a lot of your supply base are not going to be just thinking about fairness in the way the world works. So if they had, $100,000 of tariffs that they paid on goods that they sold to you, there's a good chance that if they are passing that through, they're not just passing through the 100,000, right? Because they still have expectations on margin percentage that they are getting from their leadership and organization. So there's a good chance that you're paying actually more than the tariffs simply because they're wanting to maintain a margin percentage. We can kind of walk through this example. I've got this supplier, and their name is Padded Price Components, and they supply overcharge manufacturing, which is the customer, with assemblies that then OM uses as its own manufacturing processes, right? So May 2025, about a month after Liberation Day tariffs took effect, PPC raises their prices by 10%. This was just an announcement, right? They didn't call up and say it's all because of tariffs. They didn't say it was not an additional line item, right? They changed the price of the good. If it was a dollar, it's now $1.10. And they just blamed it on shifting market dynamics. And for whatever reason, you accepted that price increase, right? Maybe because you didn't have an option with another supplier. And, or perhaps, it made sense at the time, right? So your question as OM is to ask how much of that 10% can be traced back to tariffs and how much of it should then come back to me based on that. So let's talk about different data points that you can look at, and we'll talk about where they are in this example. So think about your baseline spend. And for me, the baseline spend is where your spend would have been if the tariffs had never happened. Or in this case, let's not just say the tariffs, let's call it the price increase, right? Because we know there's a price increase, that's a fact. We don't necessarily know how much of that price increase was driven by tariffs. So we're seeing a 10% gross price increase that was applied. So we know that now that's going to cost us an extra $100,000 a year based on $1 million worth of baseline spend. If we're looking at normal inflation, right, this is going to vary wildly by category, but if you just looked at the producer price index over 2025, the average was about 3%. So let's assume that this is an average industry, right? So that's the type of increase I would have expected from my average supplier. So that leaves me with a differential of 7%, right? So when I'm looking at this from the high level, I'm thinking I paid an extra $100,000. I think maybe 30 of that is probably truly inflationary. Let's talk about the tariff portion, which I think could be up to $70,000, right? So that is now, we've basically sized the opportunity. And of course, this doesn't mean that they're going to give you back $70,000. It doesn't mean that that's true, right? But it's a good starting point. So once you do this for all of your suppliers, you're going to have to prioritize where the economics are worth it, right? Everything that you do with a supplier to make a request is going to take time from your people, right? So whether that's your team or yourself as a business owner, you're going to have to chase it. So don't chase everybody, right? Follow where you have both money and leverage. And we'll kind of talk about that. So it's how much embedded cost is really there, right? How much of this do I believe could be tariffs that were then refunded to this supplier that I should be asking back for? And do I have the leverage to get it back, right? So, and when I say leverage, it's really negotiating leverage, right? How much control or power do you have over this supplier, right? If you are 30% of their revenues, you probably have a lot of leverage over them. If they are one of the large metal distributors in the United States and even their big customers equal 0.02% of their business, you probably don't have as much negotiating leverage, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask. So for high cost, high leverage, if you think about this as quadrants, that's exactly where you should go, right? I've got a lot of potential that I could get back, and I've got a lot of leverage. That's where I should focus first. If you've got a lot of opportunity but low, maybe you get creative, but you still work towards it to see if there's some type of benefit you can garner. And if it's low cost, just leave it, right? There's probably not going to be enough return on your invested time that you put into it. So, and watch concentration. We always talk about the 80-20 rule, but I think you'll see after you do your initial assessment, you're going to find there's a very small number of your supply base that hold the bulk of your opportunity, right? So by focusing on just a few, you can likely garner the most reward for the time that you spend. And contract timing is leverage too, right? So this is another one just to kind of think about if you're at a point where you're about to renegotiate, right? If you do an annual negotiator, maybe you have a certain contracted amount of spend with someone. If you have anything that's coming up, or maybe you have a new RFQ that you're sending them, that can definitely help to warm up the ask, right? Instead of just going out to say, I think you owe me money because of tariffs, having something else to offer, if that's where you are, is really good. Russell?
Yeah, just to add to that and echo it, Ryan, when we're speaking to our importer clients, they're seeing these as relationship-based decisions and conversations. And if they know you're an important future customer, I think they're much more receptive to having the conversations. Two things that aren't working. One is not asking. That sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it's interesting how many importers have told me their customers are not even asking for refund. They're not talking to them. I've had several conversations with importers that say, yeah, we've got a few million. I guess we're keeping it. I mean, and so ask is my first piece of advice on that. So the other counterpoint to that is don't just send out a form letter generic form letter to all your suppliers. We've actually had quite a few importers get these generic letters that look like they went to a company's most important supplier and their smallest one that just says, hey, can you please give me an accounting of all the tariffs you owe me within a week and then refund our tariffs within 30 days of receipt. It so transparently comes across as just a generic ask that I think most importers are not really responding to it unless it's a very valuable customer.
Now, I think that's a really good point. And, I do believe here that once again, that's where there is time that it takes to put this together in a thoughtful process that's really, I think, going to be successful. I don't think the kind of, throwing the same letter out to everybody is going to drive much success for many people. So as you're preparing to talk to a supplier, I like to call it building the fact base, right? So talk about all the research that you have done, right? And then talk about how you want to ask for what works, and how it might come back to provide value to you. I think the best thing to remember is that as you're putting these things together, you're going to have to likely make a lot of assumptions, right? If you knew every single thing about your suppliers, supply base, and suppliers and their margin numbers, you wouldn't have to be having this conversation. There probably would have even been contractual language that would have garnered this refund to you in the past. So you're going to have to make a lot of assumptions. And I tell people the best thing that a supplier can tell you is that you're wrong on your math, because then you can ask them, well, show me the numbers, right? If I'm wrong in my assumptions, because you've told me before that you're getting a small portion of your components from these countries, which I know would have been affected by these tariffs unless they're exempted, right? And that doesn't make sense for the type of commodities that I know you're using. Those types of discussions can really be helpful. And I will say that whether you get the tariff money back, knowing more about the actual cost basis and breakdown of the goods you buy is only of value to you now and in the future. So these are kind of this. A few of these are, I would say, a little bit the same, but different at times. But you can talk about different ways that you might structure the ask depending on the relationship with the supplier. So the first one is kind of what we're all thinking when we talk about this, and just a credit or a rebate, right? You have passed tariffs through to me as an end customer. I know you're getting refunds. Just send me the money back, right? Write me a check for the amount. And that is, I think, the best thing, right? We want the money back. We want it now. But if that's not going to work, we do have some other opportunities that can still drive value, even if we don't necessarily believe that we're made whole for what happened in the past, especially if we don't have the leverage. A forward price reset, right? So maybe we know that the tariff basis might have changed now. Maybe they're paying a lot less. And we can talk about how that is going to affect the pricing in from now into the future. I would say that this is another good opportunity to drive contractual language around cost sharing and or what would happen in the future when things happen, so that you're not just getting a request for a price increase in the future. You're getting detailed information if there is a contractual way that you say this is how we adjust our pricing going forward. Shared recovery agreement. So this is just kind of another, I would say this is the softer version of the credit and rebate, right? So making sure that when they receive their refunds, you're splitting that benefit, right? Maybe even if you're not getting your 100% back, they're going to talk to, you're going to get a lot of things thrown at you. It's like, well, we had to carry this cost for a long time. We ate some of it at the beginning, right? So maybe you can develop something that you agree that once they get paid, you're going to get some type of refund. And then TCO, so total cost of ownership, right? Really just thinking about how I can use this time, even if I didn't get the money back, right? That I'm here negotiating today. How can I improve my cost structure going forward? How can I improve this supplier? How can I improve my supplier relationship? And then, the next steps, really, whether you're the importer or you absorbed it through your suppliers, where we've been focused today, the worst outcome is assuming there's nothing to do. And I think, Russell said that, it right there. And then I think the biggest thing too is that leadership, whether that's the owner of the company or, if you're publicly traded, whomever, someone is going to be asking, did the people at your site, your business, do everything to understand, number one, what the opportunity was? And did you invest enough resources to try and get that back, right? Anytime there's value on the table, everyone wants to know that you've tried to maximize that value for your organization as best as possible. So that is what I had prepared. And then, Russell, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add as a closing statement before we get into questions from the folks on the webinar.
I think you covered all the important points there, Ryan. Great advice for the audience. I do just have, I guess, two other comments that come up quite frequently in recent conversations with our clients. One is question about how litigation, like how often this is getting litigious. We have not yet actually seen a lot of actual lawsuits directly based on this, like a supplier, an importer refusing to pass on tariffs. Those may be coming down the road, of course, as conversations happen. But litigation is obviously very expensive and I think would be rare unless you're talking about like a one-off purchase. If you made like a very large purchase from a foreign supplier on which there was a clear tariff surcharge and maybe you bought some equipment for millions of dollars and you had to pay a very specific amount of tariff, is IEEPA tariffs and it's well documented. You could have the grounds to go use litigation. It's always a last resort from my perspective as a lawyer, but it's possible. We have seen some litigation in the form of class action lawsuits where some plaintiffs' lawyers are actually suing large companies saying, we know that you pass these tariffs on to your end customers. So we're filing a class action, which means like a collective lawsuit on behalf of all people who may have bought, sunglasses from company X or shoes from company Y. And so those are starting to make their way through the courts. Those are going to be interesting lawsuits, especially if you're sort of in the middle between a large importer and an end customer. But those are still, frankly, in their early days.
Okay.
Sorry about my light here.
No.
But on the similar lines, we are now open for questions. So feel free to put your questions in a Q&A on the bottom of your screen or just in the chat. We are monitoring both. But I know that we have a couple of companies online here with us who are importer of record and they have their clients. What would you recommend for them? How to kind of proactively see if they can refund, or what's your take on that?
Well, it's a good question. You know, going back to sort of my earlier comment is some importers are just sort of waiting for their customers to come to them. They are not necessarily going to do anything unless they are asked for a conversation by their customers. Having said that, we do have a much larger set of other importing clients that are proactively trying to do this calculation from their side as well and figure out, how do we actually assess the amount of refunds we got and figure out how much we should pass on to our customers. I think if you had a tariff surcharge on an order, like if you had an existing PO and had to add a new charge, it's a little bit easier to do that math and say, well, we really should owe that back to our customers. But in most cases, there's not a clear contractual obligation to pass that on, which is what we're concerned as lawyers is, do you have a legal obligation to pass that on? In many cases, frankly, the importers have done sort of a hybrid where they may have gotten their overseas supplier to eat part of the cost and share part of it. They've absorbed part of the cost, as Ryan was saying, and then they passed on some fraction to their customer. So they're trying to figure out, do they actually owe that back to the customer if it's only a fraction of the tariffs? They also, feel that they have some administrative costs related to this whole process, right? So they feel like it's reasonable to hold back any costs they incurred through trying to get the refunds. So they're not necessarily easily able to figure out from their own side what should be passed on to their customers.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good point, right? We're focused here on the non-importer of record, right? And how they can garner that back. But if there are importers of record on the call, probably good to think through what your own cost basis was if you don't understand it and how tariffs affected it so that you're ready to talk if you do have customers that have high leverage with you that are calling and asking for refunds so that you're prepared to have that discussion in an effective manner.
Yeah, because I think it works both ways, right? There are people that have customers, and maybe some customers are asking, and some customers are not asking. Again, like just kind of from what you said, and it's similar lines. But it's I think it's all coming back to, and I know we always talk about in our a lot of our trainings, it's about clean records, which is very, very hard to keep all the documentation and but I think this is more important than ever to have all those records, especially with all the future tariffs and everything else kind of that coming up our way. Let's see if we have any other questions or comments in the chat. I don't see anything here in the chat, but so let's see, it's 9:41. So Russell, Ryan, do you have anything else to add that you would like to add? Or some closing remarks you'd like to make?
I just want to emphasize again the fact that I think we may see this tariff refund issue come up again in the future. Um, a the Court of International Trade has already ruled in an initial ruling that the Section 122 tariffs that were in place from February to July of this year, those were a blanket 10% tariff on most goods imported. There were a few exceptions, but most goods imported to the US paid a 10% tariff. Those have already been ruled illegal on a preliminary ruling. That decision was then stayed, meaning sort of like paused by an intermediate court. And that one, frankly, is probably also going to make its way all the way up to the US Supreme Court. That's a 12 to 18-month process at best. So, and we will likely see that, as I said, there's new litigation on these Section 301 forced labor tariffs. So I think, it's really helpful for clarity and sort of business planning purposes to make sure we're more precise in our contractual terms with our suppliers. If your supplier is talking about a price increase, it'd be really nice to say, is this related to tariffs, or let's talk about it. They don't have to provide their whole, they don't want to necessarily share their whole supply chain with you. Again, it very much depends on the industry. But they might be able to share information about their price increases and say, okay, we're going to apply this one as a specific tariff surcharge. And if refund, we will refund it to you. These are all, to me, negotiations based on the relationship. But I think clarity actually benefits the importer and the downstream customer.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think, I've kind of alluded to it many times in that while your goal for a lot of these negotiations is to get back money that you think you are deserving of, right? Because they're getting refunds. But even if you don't get them, the ability to negotiate better contractual language going forward with your suppliers, right? As Russell said, there may be future tariffs that are potentially refunded if the courts decide that some of these are that are currently still legal and being charged are okay, or if they're not okay, they may get refunded. At least you're set up for the future, right? And I would think, use this as a time to reset the entire commercial relationship if possible, right? Not just thinking about tariffs, but how do I handle commodity pricing increases and things like that? Really making sure that you are only absorbing the cost of true increases of cost to your supplier. You're not padding their margins on top of that, and that it goes both ways, right? That when there is benefit in the market, whether that's from a commodity price decrease or tariff refunds, things like that, that you are going to get your portion of that within a specified amount of time too.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Russell. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Again, I just want to remind you that we do have $1,000 reimbursable grant available, and that grant is available if you're looking to have some consulting or some to talk to Ryan specifically or to Russell about mitigating tariffs. Please do reach out. Do reach out through the chat or our request form, or just feel free to send us an email if you have questions about that. With that, I also want to again say thank you to Ryan and Russell. Let's say thank you to them for spending the time preparing the materials and really walking us through. It's such a complicated topic. And for everybody, I'd like to invite you to a webinar next Friday. Next Friday, we're gonna dive into 301 tariffs, um, and have all the updates on that. And with that, I wish everybody a great Friday. And as we say here at World Trade Center Denver, keep calm and trade on. Thank you, everybody.